Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE exam and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and essay grader, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free at achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. So today we have Seth Capron from TestCrackers back on the line with us, and I'm really excited to have you back, Seth. Thanks for joining us. Could you please just introduce yourself for the people that don't know you or haven't heard your last episode?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Tyler. My name's Seth. I'm one of the co-founders of TestCrackers, and been doing that for about 10 years. We offer small group GMAT and GRE prep classes online. We also offer private tutoring. Basically, for us, we found some people find the structure of weekly 3-hour courses and a lot of one-on-one and kind of interactive time with instructors to go over questions is most effective way to build up a score.
Yeah, fantastic. And so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the GRE Verbal section, specifically mastering inference questions. And I am really excited for this because I love when we get nitty gritty with problems. I'm curious though, just because, I don't think everybody maybe knows what this is. Could you give us a quick intro as to kind of like what an inference question is and kind of just like why they're tricky for people on the GRE Verbal?
Yeah, totally. So, backing up a second, just in terms of context, GRE Verbal can be split kind of down the middle between vocab-based questions and reading comp-based questions. And, within the reading comp ones, any sort of passage where it's asking you some sort of question about the material you read, what I find is more than anything else, the common source of the most errors for students are inference questions. They're
Hmm.
among the most common questions overall. You'll see a lot of these on the test. And the other one that's nearly as common is what I call according to the passage questions. It's actually quite similar in strategy. So a lot of what we'll talk about today really could apply to those as well. And but to the extent that it is different at all, those are questions that tend to be a little easier for people. So yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to focus on them.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that the key thing that is tricky about these tests in general and makes both the GRE and GMAT like pretty different from the ACT and SAT is that they're asking you to figure out what the problem is, kind of. Like like there's like a sort of a layer of like what am I supposed to do here added on top of also needing to know, the requisite rules to solve things and things like that. So,
Yeah, and
um
honestly, it's quite confusing how that's laid out as well. And it's like a game where no one quite tells you the rules because the way inference questions work on this test to me isn't intuitive or obvious or even really what I think of the word inference as meaning in normal life. And so, if you don't know that, it's kind of easy to come at these the wrong way. So, I mean, part of what you asked was how to recognize these, and just to start with that, when it has the word infer, something like what can be properly inferred from the passage, that's a little bit
right.
clearer. But there's a lot of other ways you could ask an inference as well. If it says which one of the following does the passage suggest or imply, that's an inference too. Or even if it says,
Mm,
the author would be most likely to agree with which of the following. To me, I lump those all in the same category of inference.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, so then how do we solve these types of questions? Like, or maybe actually first before that, let's kind of, before we go into examples, maybe we start with just like some frameworks
Well,
that are helpful in general, right?
yeah, I mean, I just want to talk about what an inference is, and I have a thought experiment for you. We'll see how see if you play along the way I'm hoping you do, Tyler. So
Sure.
I want you to imagine a situation for me. Imagine on this call here, we're talking to each other through our computers, and you hear tons of people screaming in excitement in the background. What's a good inference?
Hmm. Right. Well, maybe that you're at a bar, or like during a sports game,
Great.
or that there's a fire or something. It depends on the types of screams.
Yeah, it does. Any other ideas?
Um, no, not really. Unless you have like a studio audience.
Yeah, I've got some canned laughter that I'm playing on repeat so that it sounds like people think I'm funny. No, these are all great guesses. And the reason I bring that up is it's a good demonstration of how the way we use the word inference in normal life is not really what the test writers mean. Because on the exam, none of the things you bring up have even the most remote chance of being a good answer. Because
Huh.
an inference is not a pretty good guess. If we're getting technical here, that's called an inductive inference, and that's the idea of sort of building upon what facts you have to make a good guess. But what they are actually
Mhm.
asking you for, though they never specify, is a deductive inference, which is what I would call an
Mm.
airtight conclusion, or something that's really 100% provable. Does that make sense as kind of just a rule that you might not know going in, but you kind of need to do these questions?
Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, I guess like I don't know what a deductive inference how it would be different.
Well, it's 100% provable. And that gets at a kind of another important kind of distinction here. Most of us think of an inference as something that goes beyond what is said in the passage. So, for example, if I tell you that I am 6 feet tall, is it inferable that I'm over 5 feet tall?
Yes, assuming you're telling the truth.
Yeah. Again, if I am 6 feet tall, then it's provable that I'm over 5 feet tall. What if I tell you that I'm 6 feet tall? Is it inferable that I'm 6 feet tall?
Uh, maybe.
Well, and again,
Like I'm like
this is
worried about answering this.
yeah, and this is just the sort of rules for the game that you need to know. It's
Mhm.
okay in terms of answer choices on the GRE and the GMAT as well. These things work very similarly there. If something is directly stated, it still counts as an inference, which, again, on some sort of semantic level, I'm not sure I agree with, because I would say that's not inferred, it's just stated. Just stated is okay. And so that's why I really push people to think about an inference on this exam as just anything that's 100% provable based entirely on the passage. And that's the third point I want to make here, based entirely on the text of the passage. It's not about something you know to be true yourself or that, from outside information is provable. It's just about something that's provable based solely on the text you're given.
Got it. And it has to be like it's like in the context of the question, right? Like if the passage says, asks you to infer that the sky is blue, but the passage does not say that the sky is blue, you can't answer that the sky is blue, even though you know it's true in real life. That
Yeah,
is that roughly true?
Yes, although except for the thing about the sky being blue, which that's a whole long conversation. The sky isn't actually blue if you dig into the science of it, but we'll leave that off the table for now.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to come up with an obvious
No,
example.
I hear you. So yeah, this is the idea. And I want to get to one more point about this, which I think is kind of more broadly true of approaching verbal problems on the GRE. I think it's super helpful to remember that these are games. These are questions that are written by humans and not just created through some sort of formal process the way math questions are. They're made by
Hmm.
humans and it's 100% provable, to use that term again, that these people are a-holes.
Well, I don't know if they would think of it that way, but their goal is to come up with questions that are meant to deceive you. I think is maybe the way that I would put it. And it's
I,
frustrating because a lot of the time you're like, what just test me, right? But beating the deception is part of the test, I guess.
yeah, I mean, I'm joking to say that I don't think it's fair to judge them as humans, but I think it is fair to say that they're behaving in a way that's kind of mean. And maybe they have good reasons for doing so, but you have to kind of have that in mind with these questions. And so if you approach these with a somewhat loose attitude of like, oh yeah, it basically said that, it's really easy to get them wrong. And,
Right.
it's this sort of lawyerly attention to the literal text, the literal details, where you have to say, is that precisely the thing that's provable from the passage, or is it approximately? And that approximate is often going to be enough to be wrong. And this gets me to
Mm.
I haven't kept a track of the numbers, maybe fourth key point about inferences. Um,
Hmm.
Inferences are about details, not about generalities, uh, most of the time. And so when you're asked questions about a passage, there are sometimes these kind of big picture questions. Normally, those are purpose questions, things like the main idea or like why did the author do something. For those, you have to take a step back. These ones really tend to be about really specific details. And even if it asks you something like, which of the following would the author most likely agree with, your job isn't to sort of take the entire text and from it distill a sense of the author's overall view and from that answer it. You're supposed to be able to pinpoint the specific language that proves what the author would or would not agree with. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's another misconception. You can infer something sometimes that flies in the face of what the general attitude of the author was. If you can
Mm.
pinpoint that little detail that shows, well, that's actually provable.
Right. So it's in a lot of ways, you're being asked to be kind of almost like I don't want to say like a critical of the author, but it's more like you're you're trying to suss out sort of fact from fiction, like you said, almost like you're a lawyer or like something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you picture these sort of like aha courtroom moments, right? Where the argument says, um, no one should, be without representation in by a lawyer in a court of law. And sure, some people have committed heinous crimes and deserve punishment no matter what, but the vast majority of people are going to benefit from this. And you say, aha, you just admitted some people really don't deserve a lawyer because, that shows that this isn't necessarily true, or what you're kind of grabbing on this thing that may not have been their point, but that was sort of there along the way.
Got it.
Anyway,
Yeah, very cool.
so I want to kind of that's the overall sort of just things to keep in mind or common misconceptions. I want to introduce a framework specifically for doing this with all that in mind, and then get some examples of practicing it. And to do it, I need the metaphor of a track and field event called the high jump. Are you familiar with that, Tyler?
I mean, familiar with it in terms of like I've watched it, I've never performed it.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't need a real high level understanding of it. But how's the high jump work?
You run at something, then you put your pole in the
Oh
ground
no,
and
that's
you
the
fly
pole
over the
vault.
bar.
This is a common
Oh, oh.
common confusion. The pole vault's the one where you've got the pole. I'm just talking about the one where you have to jump over it with no pole. Though the metaphor would still work for the pole vault.
Yeah. So yeah, you just run at something and then you jump over it and land on a little crash pad, right?
That's it. Yeah. So there are only really two things that I think matter in the high jump in understanding whether a given person is going to be successful. And one of them is how good that person is at jumping and how high they can jump. But in and of itself, that's actually not enough information. What's the other piece of information we need?
Uh, for lack of a better word, like it. Well, okay. There's I have two answers. Answer number one is their technique, and then answer number two is like the height of the bar, I guess.
Yeah, and that second one's the one I'm getting more at here. It's this
Hmm.
match or mismatch between the height the person jumps and the height of the bar that determines success. And what that means is you can
Mm.
imagine a really low bar, and all of us, more or less, are going to be able to clear that bar, right? With some exceptions, if a bar is like 2 inches off the ground, most people can get over that. And so it's not
Hmm.
really that much of a challenge. And that doesn't mean always, but it does mean it's a lot easier to clear. And if the bar is 30 feet off the ground, I don't actually know the world record for the high jump, but I'm pretty sure no one can jump that high. And so it kind of
Oh
doesn't
yeah,
matter how good you are at jumping, you're just not going to make
and that's exactly kind of the I guess what you're getting at with regards to these inference questions, right, is that you got to figure out where the bar, what is the bar, and then does it clear the bar? It being, I don't know, whatever's in the passage or what have you.
Exactly. That's over and over again. That's the thought process I like to use to approach an inference question, which is you actually want to start with the answer choices. You want to start by reading an answer choice and really pay attention to the specific language used and say, this sets a bar. And now, can the passage clear that bar is the question you ask yourself. But you want to be hyper specific when you set the height of the bar. I'll give you two tools to think about that, which I call scope and intensity. Scope's pretty
Mm,
straightforward. Who, what, when, where. Who are we talking about? What are we talking about? When are we talking about? Where are we talking about? And the point is, the scopes need to match. If the answer choice is about Ohio and the passage is about Illinois, they're right next to each other, but it doesn't matter. I think they're right next
right.
to each other. But
Close enough.
the point is that you need to have information that's actually about the same stuff. And if it's not about the right who, the right what, the right when, the right where, it's not inferable. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Right.
And the second one is intensity. This is where we really get into the lawyer world because normal humans don't pay attention to intensity the way lawyers do or the way the people writing this exam do. If I say, hey, every time I go to Chicago, I like to eat deep dish pizza. Well, that's not true. I hate deep dish pizza. I think it's an abomination. Not a fan of Chicago pizza. But regardless, I probably don't mean every time. I probably mean like most of the time. Nobody's going to call me out on it, but the test writers will. If they use a word like every, they mean every. And if an answer choice has a word like every, that sets an almost impossibly high bar, kind of like that 30-foot bar I was talking about. You see where I'm going with this?
Right. You have to prove without a shadow of a doubt that it's literally every single time.
And that's not impossible. If you've got equally strong language in the passage, you can prove it. Or if you have even stronger language in the passage, you can prove it. But you just want to be skeptical. You want to make sure you pick up on those keywords when you're thinking about the height of the bar. This all makes sense?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
So,
Basically, you got to hunt for information on what is the bar and how hard or how high is the bar, I guess, to keep using the metaphor in the passage or in the question, before you can even really start, right? Like, you got to figure out what you're even trying to solve.
yeah, and again, the more detailed you can be about that, the better. A lot of people go wrong because they read a sentence like, you know, there will definitely be problems if they continue to use the current policy. And they read that as this current policy is flawed. And
Hmm.
that's not right. Even if we know for sure, 100% provable that the current policy is flawed, that's not strong enough to prove that there will definitely be problems in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
So,
does.
quick summary here, right? So, the metaphor of the high jump. First job is to think about the language in the answer choice that sets the height of the bar. And broadly speaking, you can think about that as scope and intensity. The scopes need to
Hmm.
match, and the passage intensity must be greater than or equal to the answer choice intensity. So, number 5, I think I'm at here, key ideas greater than or equal to. Some people get turned off by an answer choice that's less strong than the language in the passage. And they say, oh, that's not what the
Mm.
passage said. And that's not a problem. If the passage says something stronger than what's in the answer choice, it's still inferable.
Mm. Yeah, and also it's in a way, like, that means that the bar is lower, right? If I'm kind of picking up on your metaphors
Exactly.
correctly.
Yeah. And so it's like the passage sailed way over the bar. The high
Hmm.
jumper was 10 feet and the bar was only 6 feet. Not a problem.
Hmm.
And again, just quick example of this, right? If we have a passage that says all dogs are cute, and we have an answer choice that says, which of the following is inferable? My dog is cute. Is that inferable?
Uh, like, no, because it's a really high bar to clear, and
Well, so the
there
answer
isn't really a
choice
ton
is
of
the one,
proof.
though, that says my dog is cute, not the passage. And so
Hmm.
the bar we have to prove is just that my dog is cute. And if the passage told us definitively that all dogs are cute, we're good.
Oh, I see. So, like basically, you should essentially act as if the only information that matters in the whole world is just what's in that passage.
Exactly. And that's what we're getting at. Tyler, you're looking at my dog in the background of our call, and you're thinking that dog is not cute, and that is irrelevant to this topic.
Right.
Now, again, but if you flip this, it doesn't work, right? If the passage states that my dog is cute, you certainly can't infer that all dogs are cute, even
Right.
if that might kind of be true from your perspective. So
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
this is
I'm following all this. Yeah. Sorry.
no problem at all. No, and it's this is the point of the conversation, is to kind of work through these things. So
Hmm.
just to highlight a couple specific things to look out for, in terms of setting the
Hmm.
bar height. I already alluded to this a little bit. Things like this will happen, or it would happen, versus it may happen, or it could happen. Huge difference in bar height. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah.
To prove that something will happen is very hard. To prove that it may happen is relatively easy. Another one is like, this is the best option versus this is a better option, or this is a good option. You've got this descending order of intensity there of how high your
Hmm.
bar is. It's hard to show something's the best. You might, but you're going to need something really specific to do so.
Yeah.
Another big one is comparative language, right? If we
Hmm.
say, this person is, faster than this other person, or, older, right? We kind of need to know something about both of those people. Um,
Hmm.
and so that is a very specific bar, the bar required for comparative language. And there's also just words that are sort of vague and hard to prove in general that you want to just make sure you don't kind of ignore for that reason. And you just say they're
Hmm.
going to need to be justified. They love to throw words like common or controversial into wrong answers because it's easy to just kind of be like, oh, yeah, it's probably a common tactic. But was it? There needs to be proof that it was common to choose that. Or
In the
in the
passage.
passage, like, or yeah, that sounds kind of controversial. Maybe, but it's not controversial unless there's something in the passage to justify that word controversial. It's almost
Right.
always going to either be a single word or phrase, or in the trickier ones, it's what I call an A plus B equals C situation, where it's
Mm.
not there in one place, but if you grab these two little snippets from different parts of the passage, maybe whole paragraphs apart, you can add them together to sort of prove the point you're making.
Got it.
So anyway, this is kind of a long, somewhat rambling introduction here, but hopefully I think kind of covers some of the key ideas to have in mind about inference problems more broadly. And I think it is a topic that's worth this level of interrogation because it's so confusing to people and such a common source of errors.
Right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
you okay if we go into some specific examples to kind of talk about how to use this?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that like it all makes sense in abstract, and I also think that like most GRE problems, especially when you get into the harder ones on the verbal side, the devil is in the details.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And again, I know we're talking about inference questions. I do want to restate the idea that according to the passage, questions work very similarly, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is similar to how those work. So you can kind of compare some of these ideas. They're very almost overlapping question types, and very common as well. So the first question I want to talk about says, the research described in the passage most clearly supports which of the following claims about the abandonment of Mesa Verde. And here's another key point. This doesn't necessarily sound like an inference to a lot of people. Do you know what a lot of people might mistake that for?
I don't know what the question type is that people would mistake it for now.
So I call it a strengthen question. When people see the
Hmm.
word support, a lot of times they think it's a strengthen. The problem here is a strengthen question would be asking us about which of the following, if true, supports the argument above, whereas this is saying the passage above or the research above supports which of the following. So the passage is supporting an answer choice. That's another way to ask an inference.
Got it.
And so,
Okay.
again, that's the question here. Which of the following is supported by the passage about the abandonment of Mesa Verde? And when I look at the answer choices, the first one says it likely resulted from factors affecting crop viability. Any idea what are keywords we could think about in that answer choice?
Well, likely.
Yeah, that sort of softens it a little bit. It could have said it resulted from factors, and that would have put the bar higher. But still, that word resulted, even though sort of softened, is the key word, because that shows us causation. Causation's a super important idea in verbal questions. And so that's kind of the standard we have to go back to the passage and look for and say, is there anything that tells us it likely resulted from these factors? Again, I'm not going to read the whole passage and find it there, but that's just the process we're thinking about. If we compare that with B, it says it was more extensive than had previously been documented. Any notes about the difference in that one?
Yeah, so now you're comparing it to the past,
Yeah,
which might be more easy to prove depending on what's in the passage, or it might not be there.
but importantly, not only are you comparing it to the past, you're definitively comparing it to the past. Not it likely was more extensive, but now it was more extensive. And so in this case, again, especially if we're just talking about people's theories based on archaeological findings, it's going to be pretty hard to say definitively that it was more extensive. And so you want to be a little bit skeptical from the start, not to cross it out alone, but to be a bit more skeptical. And so I would argue, an answer like B is likely to be what I'd call too strong. It's something that, maybe is similar to what's said in the passage and is tempting for that reason, but is too strong. And then just to give one more sample example from the same question, C says, it may have been hastened by the abundance of wild animals in the area. What do you feel about that one?
Well, it may have been is pretty, it's like the lowest bar yet, probably.
It is. But you know what? This one turns out to be wrong anyway. And you're completely right to say it's a very low bar, and that's another kind of trap. It's a trap where you're like, oh God, I hardly need anything to prove that it may have been. The thing is, you don't get anything if we were to go back to the passage at all to prove that. And so even though it's a low bar, it still doesn't make it right unless you have that something to jump over it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again,
yeah, you still it can be a low bar, but if it's the wrong bar, then it doesn't really matter.
Exactly. And so that's, just to give one example, I wanted to talk about that. And I think, we can get some value from seeing this process without even revisiting the passage. Now, I've got another one, and this one's a choose all that apply inference. And I have to say, if you didn't believe me before that the people writing these questions were kind of jerks, the existence of choose all that apply inference questions has got to prove it for you. Because for these, at least on the multiple choice ones, and this is true for all GMAT questions, it's one of the few ways in which the GMAT's definitively easier than the GRE. You just have to choose the best answer. So you can play a little bit with this concept of 100% provable, because there's always some wiggle room there, right? I say that, but really, sometimes there'll be something where you're like, this is 99.5% provable. Do I need to choose it? And the answer is just, well, is there anything else that's better? And if there's not, you do. Choose all that apply ones, though, you're not able to do that. You're not able to fight and choose the best answer and use process of elimination. You have to kind of have an objective standard for what makes a good answer that individually all the answer choices are kind of tested against. And so it's super tricky. Now, in that case, again, that objective standard, though, is this high jump metaphor. It's the language sets a bar, can the passage clear it? And so, the example I've got here, I just want to point out all three of these are comparative answer choices. So the animals less likely to become victims of predators were the more active ones in the guppy study, but were the less active ones in the tadpole study. B, the animals less likely to become the victims of predators were those more alert to their surroundings in the guppy study, but were the less alert ones in the tadpole study. And C, the situation created experimentally for the guppy study would be more likely to occur in the wild than would the situation created for the tadpole study. So it makes sense that all of them are comparisons. We already talked about that a little bit as kind of a common and specific type of bar. You need to be able to look at two different ideas and really say, what's going on here? Is that what the passage said?
Right. And any of them could be true. You could arguably multiple will probably be true.
Yeah. It's worth noting for these choose all that apply, it will never be 0 answers. But it will be 1, 2, or 3, and you can't come up with some weird bias in your head about how many you need to choose. A lot of my students are like, well, I figured it wouldn't be 3, or I kind of figured I don't choose 1 very often, so maybe it should be 1. You just have to evaluate each answer on its own. What I think is interesting about this passage, again, were you to dig in and see it, is answer A is untrue. And that's another of the reasons wrong answers will be wrong. We talked a little bit about too strong, right? As one problem. We talked about out of scope. It was a low bar, but it just wasn't talked about in the passage at all. And now we're getting at the idea of contradicts. Some of them just aren't true. And so that's another reason an answer will be wrong. One of the answers here is true. And it's pretty much, as I said, just restating what was stated in the passage. So it's that situation where it's not really going beyond what was said in the passage or guessing or, finding any kind of educated extension of what was there. It's just yup, it said that. Does that make sense? That's B.
Yeah.
And then the last one, C, is pretty interesting. The situation created experimentally for the guppy study would be more likely to occur in the wild than would the situation created for the tadpole study. That one's tough. Because in that one, you really do have to infer something. You really do have to say, well, is there anything to tell me about the likelihood of that? And I think...
and also, what is... The passage has to include something about what the wild is like, right? You can't just, assume that.
Well, and honestly, this is part of why I bring this up. I bring this up because this is one of my least favorite inference questions in the official books. Third-party questions do this all the time. People have what I would call a sketchy standard here. I think answer choice C here is one that's really debatable, whether it meets that objective standard or not. And I can tell you the right answer is, according to this book, that it does, but I think it's a bit of a stretch, personally. And I just say this to kind of make sure people are aware of how fine this line is. I've been doing these things for a decade, and I have a very good sense as to what's inferable and what isn't from experience. And I've gone over this a lot of times, and honestly, I'm still on the fence about whether I think it's fair that they call this the right answer. And their argument is, in the guppy study, they were just hungry, whereas in the tadpole study, they were anesthetized. It's hard for me to say that word, but, they were given anesthesia. And, your job is just to say, well, the way someone acts under anesthesia is not something that is likely to occur in the wild. I say someone, I mean a tadpole. And that's kind of fair, but I'm I don't know that. Maybe the effects of anesthesia on a tadpole are really similar to how a tadpole gets when they're sleepy or something else. So, again.
And also, yeah, it's I think that, I get why they made it a right answer, though, I guess. It is, though, a little bit assumptive.
It is, and this is all I'm getting at, is that your job fundamentally is to remember that these are human-created tests, and that you're trying to calibrate your idea of what is an inference to their idea of it. And you can go a little crazy and get furious at people. More evidence that you will be tempted to call them jerks. If you get too upset about like, well, why is this the answer? Why isn't it? It's just saying, okay, point taken. I want to do as many of these as possible that were written by actual test writers that are real official questions and try to align my sense of what I'm calling an inference with theirs. But, I'm admitting to you that sometimes can feel a little bit like an arbitrary line that's drawn.
Yeah. And I mean, so then knowing that, right, like kind of how do you answer these questions? Because the thing that's, because we have the answer key, we can debate it, right? But like when you're sitting there taking the test, it feels like all of the answers are kind of like that, right? Like it feels like all the answers are a little bit context dependent or a little bit fuzzy, especially when you get to like the sort of the top most difficult questions.
Totally. And that's part of why it's so exceedingly rare to get a perfect score on the verbal section, because even very intelligent, very, sort of well rehearsed people will struggle to never miss anything because it can feel a little subjective. It comes back to, the most important point I could make to you about the verbal section, which is process of elimination is the only process. You have to do these that way because on the ones that have only one answer, although there might be some wiggle room, it's going to be relatively clear which one is the best answer if you kind of pick up on all the details. And that comes back to the second point, which is about letting go of certain things and saying with something like a choose all that apply, you can't kill yourself and spend 7 minutes on a single question trying to get to some degree of certainty. You have to say, I've got an idea of what I think the standard is, and I think this does or doesn't meet it. And you might sometimes be wrong about one of the answers. You can't expect perfection there, but you don't want to be wrong and waste 5 minutes on it. You want to make your best guess and move on. But it does come down to that objective standard, and you say, is it reasonable to say it's more likely that you're going to be hungry than you're going to be anesthetized? Still really chose a word I know how to pronounce better to discuss so in depth. And I think it is reasonable in the end, but I think it's debatably reasonable, and that's what I'm kind of making as a point.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
Do you want to look at some more of these, or what do you think?
Yeah, let's keep going through examples, kind of as many as you have, because I think they're all illustrative and good ways to kind of break down what we're talking about.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I've got one that says, the passage suggests that Moss and Tilley are most likely to disagree with the experts, quote unquote, in line 1 about which of the following. And this is a super common type of, infer about opinion question, where it says like these people are most likely to agree or to disagree about something. And it comes to, a note-taking strategy that I find helpful. Anytime there's sort of a couple clear perspectives, or I shouldn't say clear, but a couple perspectives in a passage, you want to try to make it clear how to draw a line between them. And I often do that physically in notes. I often just draw a line on my paper, and I say experts on one side, Moss and Tilley on the other, and I try to just note every detail I'm given about each of them in some sort of super abbreviated form, because it's so common to be asked to draw these sort of distinctions. And my point is, a lot of the trap answers here are going to be something that one of them definitely thinks something about, but we don't know enough about what the other one thinks about that specific topic to be able to say they disagree. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah.
So like we might know that Moss and Tilley are really worried about, kind of the sort of skill demands that workers are, have placed upon workers. But we need to know whether the experts also are worried about that to say they disagree about how important those things are. And With something like this too, where it says they're most likely to disagree about which of the following, it gets into a kind of inference question that's sometimes worth a different approach, which is a come up with your own answer first approach. When you're asked about something super specific, that can be useful. Some of the questions are so broad that that would be ridiculous. If it just says, according to the passage, which of the following is true, a million things might be true. And if it says, according to the passage, and that's an according to the passage question, it's almost identical to, according to the passage, which of the following can be inferred. Or even like, which of the following can be inferred about the Pueblo cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde. It's too vague to try to answer yourself. But something like they're most likely to disagree with the experts about which of the following, it's worth reviewing and saying, well, what are they most likely to disagree about? And it's not likely that there's going to be all that many things if there's more than one at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you want to go to another example?
Let's do it. I got a long passage here about Landowska. And it's all about this woman who was a harpsichord player and the way in which she kind of was important in the history of music. And the passage suggests that Landowska's playing embodied a rejection of which of the following. And so they're going to give you a bunch of things, and they're all things that show up in the passage. And they're all things, or, maybe not all, but many of them are going to be things that she maybe didn't do, or, didn't like, or that other people didn't like. They're all going to be sort of tempting. And the trick is with something like this, again, we have to figure out what, we have to zero in on the language and the wording of the question itself and focus on things like a rejection. And this is my other point. There's the passage itself, and that is important to evaluate closely, scope and intensity. There's the answer choices, scope and intensity. There's also just the wording of the question stem, and there can be sort of key secrets there. This embodied a rejection is a very specific thing we're asked for. And it's not just something she didn't do, it has to be something that she rejected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and embodied feels like, I don't know, it feels like a word that it's like it has to, it's not going to be obvious, but like it will essentially, it's a rejection when you really look at it thoughtfully.
Yeah, and again, some of the answers are going to be out of scope. They might not mention it at all. Some of them are going to contradict the passage or go against what was said. Some of them might be tempting because they're similar to what was said, but they're the language in the answer choice is too strong. And the right answer is going to be something that we're like, yeah, she clearly was not into this. She clearly rejected this in her performances. We get a lot of questions like that. I'm skipping one here, but jumping ahead, another question asked on the same passage. The passage suggests that Landowska would probably have objected most strongly to which of the following. Again, you might be able to answer that on your own first, because it says most strongly, so we really want to know what she was really against, and you want to make sure it's not just like what didn't she do, or what didn't she like. It's what was she upset about? What was she against? And I do want to dig into the answer choices here, because there's a lot of tricky stuff going on in this one. Answer choice A says, a performance of a Bach keyboard piece played on the harpsichord. The reason this is a bad answer is because of definitions. And this gets at the sort of tricky times when you do need a little bit of outside knowledge, even though you're allegedly not supposed to. Do you know the distinction between a keyboard, a harpsichord, and a piano?
Like not really, other than pianos seem pretty distinct, but I have no idea what the other two are.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's the problem here. So a keyboard is any musical instrument with keys. And it includes both a piano and a harpsichord. And to get this right, you have to recognize these sort of subcategories and supercategories and know how that works. And that's a little bit of a sort of annoying side note about the questions more broadly. Another reason to be angry at the test writers is like, why am I supposed to know these like semi-obscure musical facts? But it's also just
Right.
an important idea of like really tracking categories, really being able to say, this is a big group that contains some smaller items, can be super key to inferences, right? Because if we know something to be true of all keyboards, and we know that a harpsichord is a keyboard, then we can infer stuff about the harpsichord by virtue of information the passage gives us about the keyboard. And,
Right.
in this case, we can't because, a harpsichord isn't separate from a keyboard, and thus it's not something she'd object to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, like, I feel like knowing the fact that keyboards include harpsichords and pianos is something that I would definitely not know and be less equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think they sort of get a little away with this on the GRE, with the idea that vocab is part of the test, and they're like, well, you
Hmm.
need to know some definitions to answer these questions. That's another thing that sort of distinguishes the GRE from the GMAT. It's extremely rare that you need to know any vocab to answer a GMAT inference question or reading comp question in general. They'll almost always give you fully adequate context to sort of work things out, even though they might throw tricky words in there to sort of intimidate you and make you question your worth as a person. You ultimately are fine without them. On the GRE, it is more common that sometimes you do fundamentally need to know terms involved.
Got it.
And sometimes there'll be words like keyboard that aren't particularly obscure vocabulary, but still require a specific definition. Other times it'll be something like oligarchy. There's a passage I've seen that you really can't answer unless you know the word oligarchy. And that's
Hmm.
kind of a vocab word.
Right.
Back to the answer.
Yeah, not everybody knows it. I think, like, part of the joys of the GRE and GMAT is that, because it's graduate school, they're kind of expecting you to know a lot of stuff that is somewhat advanced about sort of all kinds of things, for lack of a better word.
Although again,
And yeah,
I would argue that there's a lot more of that on the GRE than the GMAT, and the GMAT tries to be more a test of your ability to reason without needing as much background. But we don't need to get into how successful it is and, and the more details there. But sticking with this answer choice for a minute, the ones to this question, um, you know, other things say things like a performance of a Handel organ piece on a Baroque pipe organ. And, again, it's this question of like, well, no, she wouldn't have a problem with that because they're both for the organ. And C, a modern composition written for a harpsichord and two pianos. She wouldn't have a problem with that either. And their whole problem, if we dig back into this, what we know about this woman is that she really didn't like it when people violated the composer's intent, when they did something the composer wouldn't like. A lot of my students are tempted by answer choice C here because they say, oh yeah, she thought that the harpsichord and piano were really different, and so she didn't like it when people would mix them, or this whole modern idea is, she was into classical music. There's actually no reason to think she wouldn't like that. D, another one my students tend to like, a piano solo in which the performer occasionally departs from the tempo indicated by the composer. See, this is another one that's really tempting, even if you've zeroed in on the idea that what she doesn't like is going out by the composers, going against their will. But when we dig
hmm,
into it, there's a little passage that talks about how she did exactly that. That she, the specific quote is, all combined with excellent judgment about when not to hold the printed note sacrosanct. She was a
right.
genius at underlining the dramatic and emotional content of a piece, and to do so she took liberties, all kinds of liberties, while nevertheless preserving the integrity of the composer's score. And so we get this sort of out saying she was okay with messing with these little things as long as you overall had the
Mm.
vision of the composer in mind.
Yeah, that all makes sense.
And the final piece of it is, in the right answer, the one she would object to is a performance of a piano and violin sonata in which the piano part is played on the harpsichord. And then we're like, yes, she would hate that because it was supposed to be a
Right.
piano part and they played it on the wrong instrument. And again, there's a
Right.
trap there. Students don't always go for that when they're like, she was a harpsichord player. She loved the harpsichord, which is true, but she was against playing things on the wrong instrument.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's like tricky to kind of, you have to break down multiple parts of both the question and the answers to get this one right.
Yeah, so again, just trying to give some case studies in it. I have one more if it's worth going in, although at this point we're quite a long episode.
No, that's okay. Let's do it. Last one.
All right, so last one here I think is interesting. It's another of these choose all that apply. It says, the passage provides evidence that Schmidt would be likely to disagree with the theory presented in the first sentence over A, the length of time it took for rocky planets to form, B, the most likely causes of the moon's impact craters, or C, the importance of cosmic dust as a seminal material and planetary formation. And I think I said or, but, of course it's choose all that apply, so who knows. But, what's interesting about this, it just goes back to this point of setting a bar and clearing it. In A, it says the length of time it took for the rocky planets to form. And so the key thing to focus on is, well, how long did they each think it would take rocky planets to form, right? And if you go back to that first sentence, it says, scientists formerly believed, blah, 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 were created by the rapid gravitational collapse of a cloud. And so you're like, okay, halfway there, we know they think it was fast. And then you dig into the second part, and you say, well, what about Schmidt? And you go, blah, blah, blah. According to this theory, cosmic dust gradually lumped into blah, blah, blah. And that's all you need. That's a good answer. Because you're like, rapid versus gradual, that's enough to make a comparison and say they didn't agree. Rapid does not equal gradual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
But it's pinpointing those little details and just saying they're going to have that. The group of people that writes this, and another key idea here, verbal questions are never written by one person and then just thrown out into the world. They get edited by committees, and those people disagree. And they say, I don't know that I think answer A is justified, and I need you to edit the language to give me something that I feel like is enough to be sure of it. And you have to find those little crumbs, those little clues to know you can choose it. Answer A, the crumbs are rapidly and gradual, and that's the exact kind of crumb you're looking for.
Right. Well, and you can, once you start to get a little more savvy with this and you do more of these practice questions, you can start to pick out these crumbs. And certainly on the easier questions, it might even be like, oh, duh, this is the answer. And then, it gets more subtle as you get to harder and harder questions.
Exactly. B, the most likely causes of the moon's impact craters. This is something that shows up a lot, where it's like, we did talk about that, but that wasn't the thing we were focused on as the difference between what scientists thought and what Schmidt thought. The craters may have occurred, and we know the scientist's theory includes something that says they were caused by the impact of objects that were in great abundance 4.5 billion years ago, but whose number appeared to have quickly decreased shortly thereafter, right? So we've got that fact about the scientist. We never get any information to think Schmidt disagreed with that, even though he disagreed with virtually everything else about their theory. So, again, a trap. And then C, the importance of cosmic dust as a seminal material fluid in planetary formation. This one is super tricky too, because the whole theory is that, they thought it was the rapid collapse of a dust cloud, and he thought it was the gradual accretion of dust particles. But they did both think cosmic dust was the stuff that made the planets. So again, not something they actually disagree about. And so it's just
cool.
Again, in quick summary of that, overall things that I find important on inference. Recognize that it's a game, and the game is, what is the height of the bar set by the scope and intensity of the language in the answer choice? Zero in on those keywords and say, is there something there to justify these keywords, to 100% prove this answer, to clear the bar set by this language? And if you cannot pinpoint it, it's not a good answer. And if you can, it is.
Okay. So, I mean, at the end of the day, like maybe let's to wrap this up, do a quick summary of kind of like the tactics here, because I feel like as we went through the examples, we kind of we like touched on a lot of the things you started at the beginning. I'd love if we could just do like a quick rundown list at the end.
Yeah,
That sound good?
Sure, let's see how well I do. So first point, right, an inference is not an educated guess. It's an airtight 100% provable conclusion based solely on the text in the passage, not on outside.
Solely.
Yep.
Exactly.
Second point, right, the language in the answers set the height of the bar. Key concepts there are scope and intensity. Scope is who, what, when, where, and we need a match. If we're talking about the causes of the impact craters versus, the age of the impact craters versus something else, those are different ideas of what we're talking about. We want to make sure that there's a match. And then the intensity in the passage must be greater than or equal to the intensity in the answer choice. That doesn't mean that a super intense answer choice with super definitive or firm language is wrong, but it does mean that it puts a burden on the passage to have as strong or stronger language.
Right.
And then, I would say kind of final among key points would be this idea that all verbal questions are subjective to some extent and require process of elimination to be certain. Because the only way to know that an answer is right is to know that there is no better answer and that all the other answers have greater flaws. And so if you focus on eliminating 4 wrong answers, you're in a much better place than if you focus on finding 1 right answer. And ideally, you can do both, and you can kind of get this doubled process that gives you 2 good reasons to choose the right answer. And as a study technique, learning from both of those is super helpful, right? Anytime you get a question wrong, you got it wrong not only because you crossed out the right answer, but also because you chose the wrong answer. And those are actually sort of separate things that you want to work on correcting that both can lead to real improvement.
Great. Well, yeah, I thought this whole episode was like a very informative and helpful guide for getting through these questions. And it really did deserve this much time, right? Because there's so many little details. And I think it just takes a lot of practice. I mean, do you have any kind of closing thoughts for people that are listening on kind of how to handle these?
Yeah, like anything, the biggest thing is not just practice, but learning from your mistakes. You need volume, certainly. You can't get better without doing a lot of these, but you also can't get better without identifying what habits, what ways of thinking you're using are leading you down wrong paths and changing them. And that's just, I think, the kind of most powerful tool of study in general is learning from mistakes. And, it's not to put too heavy a pitch in for my own services and those TestCrackers, but that's where instruction can be really useful, is when you're unable to kind of recognize that on your own. People who are able to fully understand the cause of their mistakes and change their habits without outside help are going to be able to get where they need to. What an instructor who's really good at this stuff and experience can do is to accelerate that process and help you when you're stuck at saying, this is why you're missing problems, and these are the habits you need to change.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that in general, right? I mean, yes, Achievable is a self-serve test prep course, and you don't need tutoring to do well on the GRE with it. But certainly, if there are problem areas that you are just like, I've been, kind of hitting my head against the wall with this, getting a tutor and getting sort of like someone to go back and forth with you can be really helpful and really useful for those like spot challenges, like you mentioned.
Totally. And, again, that's just, it's a question of, making sure you have a process that is moving the needle forward, and that's the ultimate gauge to anything, right? And that's what's in one way nice about these tests. I know a lot of people don't have positive feelings toward them, but you can take a practice exam and that tells you where you are. And if that's not improving, you got to do something to improve it, and it's about having a process that shows real results.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Seth Capron from TestCrackers.
Yeah.
And Achievable has a great online GRE course you can try for free at achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.